This woman thought she was just buying a broken engine in an old town garage sale. But what she found sealed inside a forgotten WWII war diary would unravel a military secret, decades of hidden grief, and a legacy no one ever dared to speak of. She wasn't a historian, not a soldier, just a small-town female mechanic with grease-stained hands and her grandfather's last name. But when she opened that rusted panel, she uncovered a story the world had tried to bury and a machine that didn't run on fuel. It ran on memory. This is not just about a broken engine. It's about the kind of pain that doesn't rust, and the woman brave enough to restore what the world forgot. But before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? We love seeing our global family in the comments. Let's get started. You ever hear about folks going looking for something they didn't even know they'd lost? That's kind of how it started for Lila Brennan, a 42-year-old mechanic from the sleepy hills of Ash Grove, Tennessee. Lila didn't look like someone chasing after ghosts. She had calloused hands, a stubborn ponytail tucked under her ball cap, and boots that had seen more oil than rain. She fixed engines for living tractors, lawnmowers, the occasional old Harley someone couldn't part with. Nothing fancy, just honest work. She never talked much about family. Folks around town knew her daddy had passed when she was just a teen, and her mama had moved down to Florida shortly after. But there was always this quiet to her, like a song with a verse missing. That winter, Ash Grove felt quieter than usual. The shop was slow, bills were piling, and when the ad popped up on an online auction site, vintage engine lot, pickup only, Laurel Hollow, something in Lila stirred. Laurel Hollow was one of those towns that time forgot a cluster of rusted rooftops, an old diner with cracked windows, and one main road where the trees leaned in like they were listening. It sat about 30 miles east, tucked between two ridges, just far enough off the map that most folks didn't bother. But Lila did. She borrowed her friend's trailer and made the drive on a gray Thursday morning. Fog clung to the treetops like the hills were still dreaming. The house was nearly falling in on itself. But in the backyard, half covered in dead leaves and sheet metal, were 5 old engines, rusted solid. Most people would have turned back, but not Lila. She loaded them all, paid cash, and thanked the old man who didn't say much, just handed her a torn receipt and nodded like he was giving away more than junk. Back at her shop that night, Lila worked alone. She didn't expect much, just wanted to salvage a few parts, maybe flip something for scrap. But one of the engines, a World War II-era inline 6, was heavier than it looked. When she tried to open the casing, it caught. There was something wedged deep in the compartment behind a steel plate, something that shouldn't have been there. She unscrewed the bolts, one by one, and pried it loose. And there, wrapped in a brittle wax cloth, was a small leather-bound journal, yellowed with age, the initials T.B. carved faintly on the cover. She froze. Her father's name was Thomas Brennan. Lila sat there in the soft hum of the shop's overhead light, engine grease still on her sleeves, her breath shallow as she turned the weathered leather journal over in her hands. T.B. Her hands trembled a little. She hadn't heard anyone say that name, Thomas Brennan Sr., in more than 30 years. Her grandfather, the one her daddy never spoke much about, the one her grandmother only mentioned in half sentences, always ending in quiet sighs and the phrase, "He went away," and some pieces never came back. She opened the cover slowly, as if afraid the years would crumble under her fingers. Inside, the first page held just one line, handwritten, steady, in dark ink. Laurel Hollow, 1944. For the days we couldn't speak of. She read those words again, and again. Laurel Hollow? The same town where she'd just bought the engine. It couldn't be coincidence. And Lila, she didn't believe in coincidence. That night, she stayed in the shop until past midnight. The cold air crept under the garage door, but she didn't feel it. She was too deep in the pages of that journal. It wasn't a mechanic's log or a soldier's manual. It was a confession. A raw, handwritten record of a young man barely out of high school, drafted into a war he didn't understand, sent to Europe, then brought home with secrets buried deeper than any grave. The journal didn't say everything outright. It hinted, it whispered between the lines, words like interrogation, cargo transports, and unmarked containers showed up in uneven handwriting. A whole passage was blacked out with ash, like someone had tried to burn the page but changed their mind halfway through. But there were names too, and sketches. A symbol Lila didn't recognize, 3 interlocked circles drawn in the margins again and again, like it haunted the man's thoughts. And then came the entry that stopped her cold. They said never to speak of the engine, to destroy it if found, but I couldn't. It's not just metal it remembers. It hums at night. I swear it knows. Lila closed the journal. The engine was right behind her on the floor, its casing cracked open, still leaking oil onto the shop towel. She turned and stared at it. Just steel and rust, wasn't it? But for the first time, she wasn't so sure. The next morning, Lila called the only person who might know anything, Miss Adeline, the town librarian, now long retired, but still sharp as a tack at 84. Adeline had known Lila's family for decades. She remembered her father, quiet and distant. She remembered her grandfather too, not from stories, but from real, war-era memories. She agreed to come by. When she arrived, scarf wrapped tight and boots clacking on the concrete, Lila handed her the journal without saying a word. Adeline read, slowly, carefully. Then she looked up and said just one thing. Your grandfather was part of something they never wanted anyone to remember. Lila froze. Her grandfather. She had assumed without even thinking that the journal belonged to her father. She sat in silence, the journal resting in her lap, her hands still smudged with oil and time. Her grandfather? She hadn't said that word aloud in years. Her fingers ran across the worn leather again. Slower this time, as if the truth had changed the way the journal felt. It wasn't just a relic anymore. It was a piece of someone she'd never truly known a man spoken about in hushed tones and half-truths. A man who had vanished into the silence of war and never really returned. Her father had rarely spoken about him. When he did, it was always short, distant. He went to war, never came back the same. And that was all. But now here, it was his voice, trapped between yellowing pages and ink that refused to fade. And somehow, she felt guilty. Like she'd opened something not meant for her. Like she was trespassing on memories she hadn't earned. But another part of her, the part that had always fixed things with her hands, leaned in closer. Because if this journal had waited decades to be found, maybe it had waited for her. Tears welled in her eyes, not the kind that fell fast and dramatic, but the kind that sat quietly, heavy behind the lashes, refusing to spill. Why didn't he ever tell us, she whispered, barely hearing her own voice. Adeline placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Some men bring home medals, some bring home silence. Lila nodded. The journal still pressed to her chest now, as if it might tell her the rest if she just held it close enough. And in that quiet little garage, with only the ticking of the space heater and the scent of rust and memory, Lila Brennan made herself a promise. She would finish what he started, even if no one else ever knew. That night, Lila sat in the corner of her shop, the journal open on her lap, the engine looming in the shadows. She didn't know where this was leading yet, but one thing was certain. This wasn't about restoring metal anymore. It was about restoring truth. And maybe finding out who her grandfather really was. The next few days passed in a fog. Not the weather kind, but the kind that settles over your heart when the past starts stirring things up. Lila found herself moving through her daily routine, but her mind was back in the garage, back with the engine, back with the journal. She couldn't stop reading it. Each night, under the yellow glow of her desk lamp, she turned the pages carefully, like lifting brittle bones from the dirt. And every time she thought she had the story figured out, it shifted. There were coordinates, not exact, but general, mentions of Route 17 past the sawmill where the train tracks bend south, descriptions of a hidden storage site, beneath the old river crossing, behind the weeping willow, and repeated warnings. Do not open the engine casing, not unless it hums. It knows when the time is right. At first, Lila thought it was the ramblings of a man broken by war. But then, something happened. On the 5th night, just as she was locking up the shop, a low vibration stirred the tools on her bench. Barely noticeable. No wind, no trucks passing by, just a hum. It was coming from the engine. Lila froze, her breath caught in her chest. She walked toward it slowly, one step at a time. No machines were running. The lights above flickered once, like they felt it too, and the engine that rusted WWII-era block of steel vibrated like it had life. She reached out, placed her fingers on the metal, and it stopped. Silence. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she brought the journal to her kitchen table, laid out her maps, and started tracing the entries. If the hum was real and not just her nerves, then this wasn't about superstition anymore. This was about something buried, something her grandfather had risked everything to record quietly, carefully, beneath the noses of men who could have erased him. The next morning, she packed her truck, toolbox, journal, flashlight, and a compass that had belonged to her dad. The directions in the journal led her past the old sawmill near Ridge Hollow, a place she hadn't driven through in years. Most of the structures were long gone, swallowed by ivy and time. Only the stone footing of a rail bridge remained. Lila parked the truck, stepped out, and followed the tree line. The wind carried the scent of river mud and wild magnolia. A hawk circled above. Silent. Watching. And then there it was. A weeping willow, bent low over the edge of a dry creek bed, just like the journal said. She crouched beside the roots, brushing away leaves, feeling along the earth. Nothing, just wet soil and stone. But then her hand struck metal. She cleared it. A rusted hatch, buried under time. She didn't hesitate. The hinges screamed in protest, but they moved. And beneath them darkness, a man-made tunnel, barely tall enough to crawl through. She clicked on her flashlight, took a breath, and went in. The air was damp, heavy with silence. Her boots echoed softly against concrete, and then she saw it. An underground room, long abandoned. Wooden crates stacked like forgotten secrets. Faded American flags stenciled on the sides. Symbols the same 3 interlocking circles from the journal painted on every surface. In the center sat a steel table, and on it, another engine, identical to the one in her garage. She approached, flashlight trembling in her grip. This one had no rust, no dust. It looked maintained, almost new. And beside it, a military file, stamped restricted, eyes only inside. A black and white photo of her grandfather in uniform. A typed mission order with his name at the top. A final note, handwritten, barely legible. They told me it wasn't my job to ask why, but I saw what it did. I heard what it whispered. Lila backed away. Not from fear, but from awe. She didn't know what the engine was. Not really. But her grandfather had guarded it, hidden it, and written the truth down for someone to find. And now that someone was her. Back in her garage that night, Lila stood over the original engine. It was quiet again. Still. But something in her had changed. She ran her fingers across the metal. "You waited, didn't you?" she whispered. And for just a second, she could have sworn she felt it hum again. Lila didn't tell anyone what she found under the willow. Not because she was afraid, but because, deep down, she felt like the story wasn't ready to be spoken yet. It still belonged to the shadows and the man who had carried it in silence for a lifetime. That night, after returning from the hidden bunker, she sat in her garage, staring at the journal. She turned to the final pages, the ones that looked like they'd been written in haste. Her grandfather's handwriting had changed, more jagged, less careful, as if time had run out, or maybe patience. One line stood out. It wasn't in any entry, just floating at the bottom of the page. Disconnected. Like a last breath. If it speaks, don't answer. Lila read it 3 times. Then she placed the journal gently on the table beside her, turned off the shop lights, and listened. Nothing. Just the usual creaks of the building settling, and the distant buzz of the fridge in the back room. She almost laughed at herself. Until it happened. A whisper. So faint, she thought it was the wind, but the doors were shut, and the whisper came again. Not words, not even a voice, really. Just a tone, like a vibration in her bones. A low hum, the same one she'd heard before. It was coming from the engine. But this time, it didn't feel mechanical. It felt intentional. She stepped closer. Her breath fogged in the cold. Her boots echoed on the concrete, and then the hum shifted, climbing, soft and steady, like something waking up. Lila reached out, placing her hand on the casing, and suddenly, she saw, not with her eyes, but behind them, a flash-like memory that wasn't hers. A dark hangar, soldiers shouting, an engine pulsing on a dolly cart, a man screaming, then silence. She staggered back. Her heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know what she had just experienced, but it felt real and familiar, like something her blood already knew. The next morning, she called Miss Adeline again. This time, her voice shook. "Miss Adeline, did my grandfather ever talk to anyone about hearing things, about engines that hummed without power?" There was a long pause on the other end. "Come by," the old woman said softly. "There's something I never showed you." Adeline lived in a weathered farmhouse on the edge of town, surrounded by dried corn stalks and wind chimes that rang without wind. She led Lila inside, to a small cedar chest near the fireplace. From it, she pulled an envelope, unmarked, sealed with wax. "Your grandfather gave this to my father in 1947, told him to hold it and not to open it unless someone with his eyes came looking." Lila frowned, his eyes. Adeline gave her a look. "You're more like him than you think." With trembling hands, Lila broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed and fragile. Typed. "Classified, eyes-only project Widowson Field Experiment Containment Engine Number 3. Lila's heart dropped. The document detailed a program designed to use sound frequencies to manipulate emotional memory. The engine she found, it wasn't built to move tanks. It was built to store trauma, to absorb the emotional residue of war, violence, death, and lock it away in vibration and steel. Her grandfather had been tasked with transporting it, but instead, he'd hidden it and left a warning. "If it speaks, don't answer." Back in her shop, Lila sat with the engine again. It no longer felt like just a relic. It felt alive. And worse, it felt burdened. like it was holding stories too heavy to carry alone. She thought of all the men and women who had touched it during the war, who had screamed near it, who had died beside it. Maybe the engine had listened, and maybe it remembered everything. For the first time in her life, Lila Brennan, the small-town mechanic who thought she'd just bought scrap, realized she was now the keeper of something no one was ever meant to carry. And yet, maybe she was the only one who could, because she knew how to fix broken things, and this engine, for all its secrets, was broken in more ways than one. She placed the journal beside it, gently, like returning a photo to its frame. Then whispered back, not in fear, but in promise. I won't answer, but I will listen. The days that followed were quiet on the surface. Lila went through the motions. She fixed a neighbor's water pump, replaced a timing belt on a local teacher's old Ford, even picked up groceries and waved at familiar faces in town. But under that calm, something was unraveling. Each night, she returned to the engine. Not to work on it, she no longer dared, but to sit with it, to listen, to feel. And every night, the same thing happened. As the garage lights dimmed and silence wrapped around her like an old coat, the hum would return. Soft, rhythmic, like a heart beating underground. But it wasn't just a hum anymore. It began to show her things. Not in dreams, not in visions, but in sudden, jarring flashes, bursts of memory that weren't hers. October 18th, 1944. Rain, mud, explosions in the distance, a soldier screaming for his mother, then blackness. January 3rd, 1945. A train station in Belgium, a young woman handing off a satchel, a kiss goodbye, then gunfire. April 1946. A sealed bunker, men in suits, the engine in the middle. They argued. One banged the table. The word liability circled the room like smoke. Every time it happened, Lila would jolt back to herself, gasping for air, her hands shaking. She wasn't just witnessing history. She was feeling it. The engine, whatever it was, had become a container of emotion, a vault of pain, of unresolved grief and memory too raw for paper. And somehow, it was sharing it with her. One night, unable to take the flashes anymore. Lila returned to the hidden bunker beneath the willow. This time, she brought gloves and a crowbar. She wasn't here to explore. She was here to find answers. Inside, the air was colder than she remembered. The second engine still sat there untouched. Pristine. She moved past it this time, behind a stack of crates. She found a steel locker, inside old reels of military film, labeled only with dates and code names, Widowson, Phase 2, Phase 3, Final Hold. She loaded one of the reels into the battered projector mounted on the wall. It flickered to life, faintly casting ghost-like images on the concrete. What she saw stole the breath from her lungs. Men. Scientists, not in uniform but in fear. They stood beside the engine, watching monitors spike with strange frequencies as soldiers screamed in adjoining rooms. Then came a shot of a man bound, weeping, screaming nonsense. And the engine. It pulsed in rhythm with him. The lead researcher, a tall man in a bow tie, faced the camera. The subject's grief is feeding the containment field. Memory is being stored at near-atomic vibration. We believe it can hold emotion permanently, but we cannot remove it, not without consequence. The screen went black, and in that silence, a simple card appeared. Project shut down. All data sealed. Do not replicate. Do not engage the unit. Lila backed away. Her grandfather hadn't just hidden something dangerous. He had stolen it to protect others from it. This wasn't about conspiracy. It was about compassion. He had seen the damage. He had carried the weight. And he had chosen not to let anyone else suffer. Lila drove home with shaking hands, headlights slicing through misty darkness. She didn't cry, not yet. But something broke open inside her. At home, she sat across from the engine. For once, it didn't hum. It was waiting. She whispered, barely audible, "You don't want to hurt anyone? Do you?" Silence. Then the faintest vibration. Not violent. Gentle. Like agreement. She touched the casing. "You remember what they couldn't. But you're not a weapon. You're a witness." And in that moment, Lila realized, this wasn't about fixing the engine. It was about giving it peace. That night, she took out her grandfather's journal again. On the back cover, she noticed something she hadn't before, etched faintly in pencil. "The engine isn't cursed. We are." The next morning, Lila didn't open the garage. No oil changes, no brake jobs, no neighbor's busted radiator to fix. Instead, she brewed herself a cup of black coffee, sat by the engine, and opened her grandfather's journal again. This time, she wasn't looking for secrets. She was looking for permission. For weeks now, she'd uncovered a story hidden beneath metal and memory, but she hadn't yet decided what to do with it. That morning, she made a choice. "I'm going to fix you," she whispered. "Not to run, not to restore function, but to restore dignity." Because this engine wasn't just steel and bolts anymore. It had become a tomb of memory, and memories, even painful ones, deserved to rest in peace. Layla began carefully. She disassembled the casing not all at once, but in sections, cataloging every part as if she were unearthing sacred relics. Inside the housing, she found layers of lead shielding, small copper nodes, and tubes lined with quartz crystal, none of it standard for any WWII machinery she'd ever worked on. But most curious of all was the heart of the machine, a cylindrical core wrapped in what looked like fabric, but shimmered under light like it was alive. It pulsed softly as she touched it. Not electrically, emotionally, like it was breathing. For 3 days, Lila worked in silence. No radio, no calls, just her, the engine, and the steady rhythm of connection. She repaired cracked lines, cleaned old connectors, replaced worn gaskets, not because the engine would ever start, but because it deserved to be whole again. Every time she removed a broken piece, she whispered aloud, "You don't need this pain anymore." Every bolt she tightened, she imagined locking sorrow back into the past, not to bury it, but to honor it. On the 4th night, as she was replacing the outer shell, she heard it again. Not a hum, not a whisper, a voice. Her grandfather's voice. Some things were never meant to be stored away. Not in metal, not in men. She didn't jump, didn't panic. She simply placed her hand on the engine and closed her eyes. And what came next wasn't a vision, it was a conversation. She saw her grandfather as a young man seated beside the engine on a freight transport, clutching the journal in his lap. He looked tired, haunted, but not broken. He turned to her, not surprised to see her. "You found it. That means you're ready." Ready for what she asked? To understand, to carry it better than I did. The scene faded, but the piece it left behind stayed. When she opened her eyes, the engine was quiet again. Still, whole, at rest. She had done it. Not because she was brilliant, not because she was chosen, but because she had listened. The next morning, Lila built a small wooden frame and placed the journal inside it. She set it on the workbench right next to the restored engine. Above it, she hung a sign. Some machines don't run on fuel. They run on memory. And sometimes, memory needs a mechanic too. She didn't call the news, didn't post about it, didn't report the engine to any authority, because this wasn't a story the world needed to exploit. It was a story the world needed to feel. And sometimes, the most powerful restorations happen in silence. That week, she wrote a letter not to the government, not to historians, but to the next person who might stumble across something that doesn't make sense. A young girl, a tired man, a veteran's grandson. If it hums, she wrote, don't be afraid. Just listen. It might be carrying something you didn't know you lost. And so, the mechanic in the old town who once thought she was just buying junk became the keeper of memory, the restorer of something broken in all of us. And the engine, for the first time in 70 years, was finally quiet. It had been 3 months since Lila restored the engine. The air in her shop felt different now. Not just cleaner, lighter, somehow, as if the grief that had clung to that machine for decades had finally exhaled and disappeared into peace. Customers still came and went. The kids from the high school still dropped by for advice on their beat-up trucks. But those who stepped into her garage, especially the old-timers, often paused near the workbench. Drawn in! They didn't always know why. They'd glance at the polished engine, the faded journal resting beside it, and the wooden plaque hanging above. Some even asked, "What's that thing do?" And Lila would smile gently. "It remembers." Most folks just nodded and let the mystery be. But every so often, someone would stay a little longer. Like Mrs. Cranston, who lost her brother in the war and never got a letter back. She stood in front of the engine one afternoon, hand trembling on her cane. "I don't know what it is, dear, but I feel like it knows how I feel." Or Leo Ramirez, the retired Navy mechanic, who walked in with skepticism and left in quiet awe. "That thing hums like the hull of a ship when it's homesick," he muttered, eyes glassy. Lila never gave them answers. She gave them space. Space to feel, to remember, to heal. And slowly, the engine became something more than just a machine. It became a chapel of memory, a sacred piece of living history that welcomed the weight no one else wanted to carry. Then one day, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived. No return address? Just a single line scrawled in looping penmanship. "I served with your grandfather. He saved more than lives." Inside was a photograph, old, worn, black and white. It showed a group of soldiers around the very same engine Lila had restored. Her grandfather stood in the center, younger than she'd ever imagined, smiling. On the back, a note. "The day it stopped screaming, we didn't know why, but he did." Lila clutched the photo to her chest. There it was proof not just of the engine's journey, but of the man who chose compassion over compliance. He had disobeyed, risked everything, so no one else would have to carry what that machine had soaked up. Lila had grown up thinking she came from ordinary roots. A mechanic's daughter, a quiet life in a town where nothing ever changed. But now, she understood. Legacy doesn't come from medals, it comes from mercy. And her grandfather's real gift wasn't what he hid. It was what he chose to not pass on. Inspired, Lila started writing. She filled notebooks with the story, not just the facts, but the feelings. She wrote for the girl she once was. Confused, quiet, fixing engines because it was the only thing that made sense. She wrote for her grandfather, who had never found the words in life but had spoken clearly through silence and steel. And she wrote for the strangers who came into her shop with burdens too heavy for words. Soon, she was invited to speak at a local high school, then at a veterans group. Then, to her surprise, a military historian from out of state called. "We heard rumors about a WWII artifact in your possession," he said. "We'd like to document it." Lila politely declined. "It's not mine," she said. "It belongs to everyone who left something behind." But she did allow one thing. She let a group of high schoolers' kids, just like she used to be, help her build a display case. They measured, sanded, stained the wood, and installed soft lights that illuminated the engine in golden hues. Above it, etched in brass, "The memory engine restored by Lila Brennan, in honor of those who carried what couldn't be said." And perhaps the most powerful moment of all came quietly. One evening, just before closing, a young girl came into the shop. She was maybe 11. Freckles, greasy ponytail, nervous hands. My granddad was in the war too. She said he never talked about it, but I think he was sad a lot. Lila nodded, crouching beside her. Mine too. The girl pointed to the engine. Does it really remember things? Lila smiled. Yes, but more importantly, it helps us remember, too. The girl stared for a long time. Then whispered, I want to fix things when I grow up. And in that quiet moment, Lila realized something. She had passed it on. Not the burden, but the hope. So, no, the world never saw headlines. There were no documentaries, no medals posthumously awarded. But somewhere in a small town, in a warm garage, under soft lights and surrounded by the smell of oil and old wood, a girl once forgotten had become a keeper of memory. A woman once ordinary had honored a legacy few ever knew existed. And a machine once built to hold the worst of war was now surrounded by the best of what made us human. Some stories aren't meant to be shouted. They're meant to be whispered, from one quiet soul to another, when the world isn't watching. Lila Brennan didn't set out to become a hero. She didn't wear a uniform. She didn't carry a flag. She was just a mechanic, the kind of person people pass by without ever truly seeing. But what she found, and what she chose to do with it, reminded us all of something deeper. Not all wounds bleed. Not all wars end on the battlefield. Her grandfather's engine didn't need to roar back to life. It needed someone brave enough to listen. And in doing so, Lila showed us that healing doesn't always come from fixing. Sometimes, it comes from honoring. Because sometimes, the most courageous thing we can do is carry the memories no one else wants to hold. The end. Up next, 2 powerful stories you won't forget. Click to keep watching and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe some stories deserve to be remembered.